welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. Oh, and as of yesterday, we're on tunein.com. Just search for Virtual Memories Show or Gil Roth, and you'll find the podcast there. Allegedly, that will allow you to listen to the podcast on your Amazon Echo devices, as if any of you have been clamoring for that. If you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. Maybe that'll inspire Apple to promote us a little bit. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week, the Virtual Memories Show. Now, speaking of virtual memories, this show continues to bring me sliding doors moments, those sort of lives you could have lived and didn't. This past Friday, I had the double whammy of back-to-back episodes at the offices of Penguin Random House and the New York Times. It was my first visit to either one, and I, of course, got to contemplating the sort of life I would have led if I'd pushed my way into publishing or real journalism instead of the safer bet of business-to-business magazines back in New Jersey. I mean, it all worked out. I've got a best of both worlds equilibrium now. I got a job with some responsibility and freedom that's not tied into a declining economic model, or so I hope. Plus, I get great conversations with writers and artists for the podcast. But, you know, we always look at what we don't have, and we wonder how things would have been different. And that brings me to the New York Times half of last Friday's trip and this week's podcast, John Leland. See, John has a new book out called Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old. And it spun out of this year-long project John had at the New York Times, profiling 6 people aged 85 and older over the course of 2015. The profiles are a blast, and you should definitely go into the Times archives and check those out, because the people just blow up your preconceptions of old age in a whole lot of ways. But with the book, with Happiness is a Choice You Make, John expanded on that work and sort of explored the lessons one can learn, that he learned from those people. And he brings his own life into the story, his aging mom, his divorce, maybe some questions similar to the ones I was just talking about. You know, the way the might-have-beens kind of distract us from all we have. It's weird. To say the book is full of wisdom shouldn't sound trite, even though that's sort of our knee-jerk reaction. None of John's subjects are portrayed as like magical elders or something. They all have their share of problems. Their bodies are falling apart. They bitch about their kids. One guy, his constant refrain is that he wants to die, and John will talk about that guy. But the book brings a lot of perspective. I hope it finds a wide audience. And it reminds me in parts of some of the work we did with Ashton Applewhite on the podcast in the last couple of years, where she really tries to focus on, well, older people and you know, the benefits that age has for us. If you're listening to this the week it comes out, and you're in the New York City area, John's doing a pair of discussions and signings to support the book. On January 23rd, he'll be at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side, which is 82nd and Broadway, from 7 to 9 p.m. And on January 25th, he'll be at the Brooklyn Historical Society with Julie Scelfo, and that starts at 6:30 p.m. Happiness is a Choice You Make. It's an awfully good and timely book, so give it a read. It's published by Sarah Crichton Books, an imprint of Farrar, Straus Giroux, and should be out in pretty much every bookstore everywhere. Now, our only caveats for this one are, John was suffering from a cold, so his voice is kind of low. And he's a professional journalist, and I think that makes him slightly reticent about being asked questions. So some of our questions kind of peter out in a way I wasn't expecting, because I think he's used to being the person who asks the questions. He's used to shutting up and letting the other person talk. And in fact, that's my job this time. So anyway, I think it's still a fun conversation. It's just something I wasn't thinking, because I rarely interview someone who's like a legit journalist. Now here's John's bio, adapted from his New York Times write-up. John Leland is a Metro reporter for the New York Times. Since joining the Times in 2000, he has covered topics ranging from the poetry of rock lyrics to the housing crisis. In 2015, he wrote a year-long series that became the basis for his new book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old. He is the author of 2 previous books, Hip, The History, from HarperCollins in 2004, A Cultural History of Hipness, and Why Kerouac Matters, The Lessons of On the Road, and They're Not What You Think, from Viking in 2007. Before joining the New York Times, Mr. Leland was a senior editor at Newsweek, editor-in-chief at Details, music critic at Newsday, and an original columnist at Spin magazine. Mr. Leland is a graduate of Columbia College and a dropout from the Monster Factory, a school for aspiring professional wrestlers. He did not last long, but he got a story. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with John Leland. You're doing a book on lessons from, people 85 years and older. Can you talk about the origin of the project? I know it came out of the profiles you did in the New York Times, but where did that project originate for you?
A couple of years before I started the series at the Times, my editor and I talked about doing something from the census, from the changing demographics of New York. Mm-hmm. And I was extremely interested in writing about older people, because I'd done a fair bit of that, and I'd really loved writing about it. I found it really emotionally very satisfying. And so I thought, I want to do something on, you looked at the demographic numbers, and one of them that jumped out was that age group of people 85 and up was one of the fastest growing age groups in the country. And they're either the fastest or one of the fastest, depending on how you cut the numbers. And so I thought, well, let's do something with that group. And I came up with this idea, I thought all the maladies, all the things, what are the things I associate with being over 85? This is what happens when you lose your vision. This is what happens when you're trying to live on Social Security and your expenses keep going up. This is what happens when you fall. And I thought, okay. But then I realized I knew the answers to all the questions I'd be asking. I sort of knew, I could envision where all those stories were going without doing any work. And so that seemed like a boring project. And we batted around some ideas. My editor was really wonderful, Amy Vership over here. And we finally said, well, let's just take a bunch of people and follow them for a year and let them show us what the stories are. In September, maybe they get in a fight with their daughter, and we could do a story on family relationships. And, in October, they get a job or start a volunteer project. And we would follow them that way. And it turned out not quite to work out in that way, but their lives did shape the way the stories went. And it was eye-opening to me, because I still thought, from my early time of meeting them, I was still thinking about what one of my gerontologists I talked to calls rewriting the Book of Job. Mm-hmm. Hey, sucks getting old in this way, sucks getting old in this way too. But I discovered that none of the people defined themselves by whatever hardships they were going through. That's only how I was defining them, and other people defined them. They all defined their lives by all the things they could still do. So their eyes were fading a little bit, or maybe they didn't walk the way they used to. No one thought of them as a person whose eyes were going bad or a person who couldn't walk as well as they used to. They thought of themselves as somebody who was really engaged with literature or loved music or had this wonderful son or daughter who was coming on Saturday. So that's how they saw their lives. And that, it took me a while, but I started to, it started to rub off on me.
Yeah, what was the moment of realizing as you were doing the profiles that this is something that could lead to a book, and a book that would involve, we'll say, a personal intrusion, that it would show how it affected your life?
Well, as I was getting towards the end of the year with the people, I started to suffer separation anxiety. It's like, I don't want to leave these people. I've gotten to know them. I've gotten involved in their lives. I've gone to jazz clubs and their vacation homes, and I've gone with them to the podiatrist and seen them in rehab. And so I didn't want to leave them. And that's when I started to think about a book. And what I came up with, and it took almost half a year or so to come up with an idea that wouldn't just rehash the newspaper series. Mm-hmm. And I thought, like, well, why not do a piece on what they taught me? And so the series is really about what it's like to be old. And the book is really about what you can learn from people that have lived 90 years. If we don't listen to them, what a mistake that is.
When you were putting the book together, how much of a challenge was it, I guess, interjecting your own life and experiences into the stories and showing that interplay?
It was completely new for me because I love being a journalist and being the guy on this side of the microphone. Mm-hmm. It was entirely different to expose myself. And I had things to expose. I was going through a divorce. It was a very amicable divorce, so there's no problem there. But still, it's like, it's a personal life. And I had problems with my foot at a certain point, and we all have lives, right? Yeah. And it's one thing to be the writer writing about other people's lives. And I got into journalism. I always say journalism is an idiom for asking questions, not giving answers. And now I had to give some answers.
Mm-hmm. Did that feed back and change how you work as a journalist? Did you see that influencing some of the pieces you've written subsequently?
In this series, yes. It helped me and I think I was getting there even during the newspaper series. I was starting to write in a little bit more emotional mode than I had been in the past. And then in 2016, really before I started working on the book, Fred Jones, one of the characters in the book, died. And I thought I couldn't, after all this time I spent with Fred, I couldn't just write Mr. Jones died of a heart attack on such and such a date. I had to really, readers had bonded with Fred Jones over the course of a year. They deserved like an emotional send-off from him. So I was able to put a little bit of myself in it. And that experience helped me write the book as well.
Yeah. How much was the that level of audience or reader interaction? I mean, how much did that feed back in as you were working through that initial year as readers started picking up on these people as characters?
Well,
did you get that sort of feedback? I don't know if there were comments enabled on those things online, but
some there were and some there weren't. But you meet people that read your stories, and they'll say, "I want to know what's going on with Helen and Howie."
What's the real story behind those two? Yeah.
And when Amy and I conceived the series, and I think we say this in the first installment, we said, this is a soap opera, or this is what did we call it? Like an elderly version of The Real World, where you never know what's going to happen. You've got these people and their voices, and some of them were so funny, and some of them were so sad and so affecting that you had to get involved emotionally.
Mm-hmm. What lessons did you derive, or what do you think the book helps you impart on others?
I think the big overarching thing is that, whatever hardships come our way, and hardships are going to come our way, we still have a lot of influence over how we process that and what role we give it in our lives. I don't mean we have control over it, because I don't really believe in control, and I don't mean we can ward off bad things, because bad things are going to happen to us. But we don't have to make those hardships our life. And we can choose to turn ourselves elsewhere. As I say in the book, you can go to a museum and think, oh, I'm confined to a wheelchair and I'm in a crowd of half-deaf people who can't hear the docent speak. Or you can say, that's Michelangelo in front of me. And it's just a switch in perspective in how you look at your life.
Do you feel you on a personal level, not regarding the circumstances you were in, could you have written this and done these profiles 10 years earlier? Like if you were 10 years younger, could you have done this?
It's hard to say, because I think that where I am now, I think this book changed me extraordinarily. Mm-hmm. So
would you have been ready?
I sort of have to compare myself, the me I was 3 years ago to the me I was 13 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how different those two things are. Probably living helped a little bit. In that time, I spent a bit of time, not a ton of time, but in Iraq. And so I saw people, and I was living among people who really were in very difficult circumstances. And they had no choice but to make their lives out of those difficult circumstances. And I think that was an educational thing for me.
Do you remember the first much older friend in your life? I would say like 20 years or so gap. Like not a work mentor sort of thing, but just, like a social relation who was not in your age range.
I guess, and let me think. We have our teachers who are kind of mentors to us, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, mine is Samuel Delaney, so it's a really weird one to begin with. But, that's, just someone you got to meet outside of school, et cetera, who, was just in a completely different age bracket, and, you pick up what you pick up from that.
I think my Kerouac time got me in contact with David Amram. And David, I think, is 87 now. And so he's only a little bit younger than me spiritually, but he's much older than me chronologically.
Yeah. Yeah, where did your fascination with the beats begin, by the way? And we're going to jump all over the place, but you've listened to the show, so that's what happens.
Yeah. So. I remain completely fascinated by the beats. I wrote a book in 2004 called Hip the History, which is sort of about how Americans imagine themselves, what stories they tell about themselves. And we've created this idea of hip out of that. And there was a chapter on the beats in that where I really started to read a little more deeply in the beats than I had in the past. And sort of took them to heart as a real literary movement.
Mm-hmm. And it continues for you?
I blow hot and cold on them. Sometimes
Tell me about some of the peaks. Tell me about some of the valleys.
Sometimes I'm really fascinated, and sometimes I think, well, there's just this kind of existential romance that's never fully developed in their work. I mean, especially Kerouac's. Mm-hmm. I think Ginsberg's the more sophisticated writer, and Burroughs as well. But I think that they leave a lot of ideas. They throw out a lot of ideas that aren't always developed. And sometimes I'm like, well, no, I want to see you explore that.
Yeah, if only you could have gone a little deeper in, but I assume the meth kind of keeps you from focusing. I'm just kidding. Or going as deep, I suppose.
Benzodrine.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Or again, you can go in the other direction like Burroughs, but... So do you feel in the process of making the book, did it help you get your life in order? Given that you describe your life being somewhat, well, with the divorce and everything else, being chaotic just at the time you're immersed in this project. Yeah,
I wouldn't describe my life necessarily as chaotic, but I'm prone to brooding and looking on the negative side of things.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Sorry, go on.
You might have met people like that at some point in your life.
Yeah.
And this turned me around entirely. I was one day, and it happened, I think I mentioned Fred Jones earlier, and I was at Fred's house one time, and we were talking about happiness, because Fred would always talk about what happiness meant to him, what gratitude meant to him, and he was so happy, and Fred was in the process of losing 2 toes to an infection that was turning into gangrene. And he lived in a 2-story walk-up, so that was going to be a hardship in his life. He had 6 kids, and he was only in touch with one of them. his brother was going through health problems, so he wasn't able to be in contact with his brother the way he wanted to. And Fred was always in a good mood, always happy. And it's like, well, what right do I have not to be happy if Fred is like this? What are my problems compared to Fred's? And I'm just on the subway, and I'm like, yeah. And I got to go back and see Fred again because I wanted another hit of that.
Well, I would say Levin goes through that at the end of Anna Karenina with his, the great epiphany before he realizes he's still a douche. When he starts, cursing out the coachman and all that, like 5 minutes after having his great epiphany. So
I think that's what the opening line means. When he said happy families are all happy in the same way and unhappy families are different. I think that means that happy families have given up this idea of the self and are directed towards others. So we're all the same in that way.
Yeah. If we consider ourselves happy.
Individuality for commonality is where happiness is.
Tolstoy or Dostoevsky?
Tolstoy.
I mean, for you.
Oh, excuse me. Tolstoy, I would say.
Okay.
No, both. Why not?
Yeah, I know. But, we all have to. But my brother always asks me with most of my literary guests, it's usually three. It's Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, Bleak House or Middlemarch, and, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the third one. Can't be Iliad, Odyssey. It's something else. But anyway, those are the at least the two major ones. Michael Tisserand bummed me out by going for Chekhov. He refused to fall into the binary, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky.
Turgenev.
Yeah, it's Chekhov. That's all it is. And, the irony being that it turned out he'd never read The Brothers Karamazov, which he only revealed to me after the podcast, which I lambasted him for. But, you do mention the change in life, et cetera. During the book, you have the single funniest line throughout it where you have this great epiphany about love being the giving of oneself and not what one receives and the wanting to see the beloved succeed and blah, blah, blah. And you mentioned that to your wife after divorce proceedings have begun, and you think that's the root of everything. And she says, no, it's because you're an asshole, John. And I burst out laughing at the time. My wife said, why? I'm like, if I tell you, it's just going to come off badly. So do you feel like less of an asshole than you were then? Or did you agree with her at the time? And,
Well, she meant that we were mad at each other, and we treated each other the way people who are mad at each other do.
Okay.
And that's an asshole. And I'm a lot less mad now at the world.
Yeah.
And so she was right.
Okay. That's what I have. Was your wife right about the reason for the divorce? Yeah. Was the actual question that I...
Well, no, that we were mad at each other. What I talk about in the book, there's two ways of answering the same question. One is that we weren't nurturing each other and rooting for the best for each other. And another is, well, that's sort of a definition of being an asshole in a marriage.
Oh, gotcha. I figured it was just cutting to the chase completely. Yeah. So, cool. Are you sort of considered as being the gray beat for the New York Times? You cover the between this series and some of the profiles that you've done, they tend to be people in their 80s and beyond. Do you sort of have a lock on that niche of New York, the silver beat or the gray beat for the Metro desk?
I love doing it, but I really could be writing about 20-year-olds next.
Yeah.
Not immediately next, because I know what's in front of me. But there's not a lot. It just happens that there's not someone doing it. Mm-hmm. At various times, we've had people assigned to that. And at one point, I was assigned to it. But I'm not now. Mm-hmm. It's just...
I just wonder with John Podhoretz and Howard Bloom and one after another, I'm like, well, he seems to have really cornered this market on the late 70s and 80s older New Yorkers. Had you experienced anything like you had with the profiles in terms of being attached to the people you the people you interviewed, or was it because this was an ongoing series that you developed more of a personal affection?
It's a great question. I think I'm really good at keeping distance from people I write about. I understand that my relationship with them is a story. And in this, I've spent so much time with people that broke down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I
wasn't quite their friends, but we had kind of that younger elder relationship. Mm-hmm. Why don't you call more often? Here, have a chocolate. Yeah,
what's it like juggling, extra parents as far as this goes? Because you also frame your relationship with your mom throughout the book. So,
Well, if you remember, people of a certain age, when your parents would always send you articles from the newspaper.
Yeah.
Jonas Mekas does the digital equivalent of that.
Yeah.
He'll send me, a couple pages from, the writings of one of the saints.
It's a lot better than, irate political rants or, something that's been forwarded 12 times from a Trump campaign. Anyway, that's neither.
It is a lot better than that.
A book I come back to every year, Every Man by Philip Roth, where, and I just read it again on New Year's Eve because I lead a very boring life, as you could probably tell, where to his lead character who goes through a number of health issues but dies in his very early 70s, there's a passage about how old age is a massacre. And it happens to coincide with a few characters this one knows dying of heart attack, cancer, etc. Did you go in with that sort of, again, sense of I don't want to say fatalism, but that sense that you were going to be deluged with people's health worries, or did you fear that none of them were going to live out the year that you were sitting down with them? Because I know you're happily surprised that as many of them have continued as they currently have. But.
I never knew if anyone would survive the year. Mm-hmm. Anytime I would call someone and didn't hear back from them, I worried. I went into it, thinking that old age was all about loss. That it was just one loss after another and without compensation. And really what I found out was that there really is that compensation. Mm-hmm. For most people. Sometimes it's not enough. And, one of the people I wrote about, John Sorensen, said it every time I was with him, he said he wanted to die. And one said, the only bad thing was he wouldn't be around to appreciate it when he finally did.
Yeah.
But I would also ask John if he wished he had died a week ago or a year ago. Was he glad he lived the year? Do you want to die tomorrow before your niece Anne is visiting? But don't you want to see Alex on Wednesday or Marcus on Tuesday? And he would be glad he lived, and he would want to live that finite period in front of him for these things. He just hated the idea that there was this sort of open-ended period of time in front of him. Mm-hmm. If he knew it was going to be 2 weeks, he could live that. If he knew it was going to be a year, he could live that. But not knowing what it would be, and maybe it was going to be 6 years of decline or 20 years of decline, that was really hard for him.
So less about death, more about dying. Being concerned about the process of dying as opposed to the finality of death.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid of death. That's right.
Yeah, that's the thing. He's afraid of the, I'm making the gesture of a downward spiral, but yeah.
He didn't believe in an afterlife. Hmm. And so he could never think about being reunited with his partner. Yeah, it was just becoming incapacitated for an indefinite period of time. Mm-hmm.
Did you get started in journalism?
I started writing about music when I was in college. Yeah. I knew I liked to write. I knew I liked music. And I didn't really know what else I liked. So after college, one of my college editors was editing a small magazine, and he asked me to write for him. And it sort of snowballed from there. The great thing about the music magazines in that period of time was they would all collapse after a year or two. And then the three people you knew at that magazine would go to three other magazines. So now you would have access to three magazines, and they would all fold. And, it's like the old Fabergé commercial where they told two friends and they told two friends.
We're dating ourselves immensely this entire episode, but keeping in that vein, I know you were sort of proto-journalist of hip-hop, but what genre were you, covering early on? Was it pretty much that space, or was that a little bit earlier?
I loved punk rock. I came to New York in 1977.
Okay, so pre-hip-hop. Yeah. How was that scene to write about back then? I mean, I know it's how difficult was it to actually, write journalism about that scene, I suppose?
You'd go to a show and there'd be 50 people there and 42 of them would be writers. And they all had fanzines and mimeograph things. And some would be writing for publications. But There was a reading interest in it because there wasn't like a radio interest in it.
Yeah. Was there an act that didn't get over that you could never figure out why they didn't get over from that era?
I wasn't interested in acts getting over or not.
Yeah, true.
A lot of times they would be lost to us once they got too big. Mm-hmm. So they were great club acts that you would just see every time. There was like a band like Yo La Tengo. They hung around, or they're still around, and they've hung around now for, I guess, probably close to 30 years or so. Mm-hmm. Even like They Might Be Giants has hung around that long, but they have a bigger audience, I think. Yeah. But Yo La Tengo, their audience has been loyal, and they're fun, and they know what they're going to get, and they get a great show every time out.
Yeah, and didn't have to be the biggest thing in the world at any point. So
they're like that good actor you see in a movie, and he or she plays like the third lead.
Yeah, the character actor.
And they make the movie better, and they can eat out at a restaurant without having people bother them. And
that guy who was in That Thing, that's the,
right.
That guy. Yeah. Yeah. How did you transition from music into regular journalism, I suppose?
Yeah, I was the music critic at Newsweek, and I started, a lot of times in that role, you get the Peter Pan syndrome that, you're the old guy in the room and you're like, I don't want to grow up. Mm-hmm. And I didn't feel so comfortable with that. The music was getting younger and I was getting older. So there you go. And then I became the editor of one of the back of the book sections at Newsweek. And I began to see that all the muscles I'd developed as a music critic actually applied to other things besides music as well. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people that are writing about music feel, well, I've got this skill, but it's not applicable to anything else. But it really is. And people that can write about music can write about anything. And I had an editor who, just sort of, it's going to be fun seeing you use those skills and that. I'd be like, really? Okay.
You actually have faith in me? Which...
Yeah, I wasn't working for her at the time. She was like former editor. But...
And dare I ask, do you keep up with music journalism at this point?
I don't, but I wish it well. I mean, I don't like the idea that the
that's what I was going to wonder. How has it changed?
Is collapsing. I just think that people used to be coming out with things. Well, what? I don't want to say because I don't know enough about it.
And what brought you to Iraq? I mean, I know it's reporting, but what was the focus?
I started to read the stories from Iraq, and they were changing, and it felt like it was getting peaceful enough that you could do the kinds of stories that I like to do, which is see people and see how their lives look to them and see what's the fabric of life. And I was really interested in thinking, well, what's the fabric of life in Iraq as we're about to pull out? So I was there at the end of 2009 and the beginning of 2010, and the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011. So just before the U.S. troops moved out. Mm-hmm. And it was a really safe period of time. So I don't think that I went through what my colleagues who were there before or after me did.
Mm-hmm. What did you learn from that experience?
Several things. My favorite thing about it was the bonding of the reporters. Mm-hmm. In that we all lived in the same house. The local staff didn't live with us, but they would work in the same house with us. And we were all close, and we relied on each other to stay alive from day to day. Mm-hmm. But also, I learned that I could go to a foreign place and report, which I had never done. So it was nice at 50 to be discovering that you can do new things.
Is that something you figured maybe at 30 you would have been better able, or was it stressful enough that you felt your years at that point, I guess?
I went because I had such regrets of not going to New Orleans after Katrina. Mm-hmm. I watched the stories come out of that, and I'm like, that's the kind of stories that I like to do. I really should have done that. And that's kind of what led me to Iraq.
Mm-hmm. You should listen to the episode that I did with Chris Rose, the Times Pick entertainment writer who fled along with everybody but came back and essentially wrote the sort of stories you're talking about, where he just who's still here and who are they, and spent a year doing that, which pretty much drove him into the ground and wiped out his life for a while. But A, he's written some amazing journalism. B, we had a pretty neat conversation in a bar in New Orleans that we recorded with all the bar noise behind it. So a little different than being in a conference room in the New York Times building, but, I work with what I got.
You can lay it in afterwards.
Yeah, we'll just have this, weird Keno machine music in the background. Along those lines, though, of what you learn with age, what do you feel you're better at? As a journalist, you mentioned, developing the muscles and then realizing you can apply those elsewhere. What do you feel you're better at as a writer now?
I think I'm better as a listener.
Mm-hmm.
I'm less interested in processing what people tell me and more interested in delving deeper into what it is and what's their thought process behind it.
Mm. And what are you worse at? What's tougher, at least?
I think I'm slower than I used to be. I think I would have 12 ideas for stories I wanted to do next. And now, if I have 2, I'm lucky.
Yeah, I think Seymour Quast says something along the same lines, but he was 86, 87 a few weeks ago when we talked. But it was, now I know what all my techniques are, but it's the ideas that take longer to put together. So
I was talking to one of my colleagues here who's 29, and he's in the midst of a story that's really hard. And he's so smart, and he's got 9 ideas, and each of them is better than the next. And you're just like, wow. And he's thrown himself into this mess where he's going to somehow force himself to develop all these 9 ideas.
Yeah.
And he's just thrown himself in blindly with the confidence that he can dig himself out. And I think as I get older, I'm less willing to do that. So there was a bittersweet thing for me because I was remembering when I would start stories with no idea how I could possibly get to the end of them. And they would be critical, idea-driven stories. And I would think, this is impossible. And you would know that you always make it. And I think I'm less willing to dive into the unknown than I used to be.
You write fiction?
Depends on who you ask.
Creative answer, so yeah.
I wouldn't be a New Yorker if I didn't have an unpublished novel in my drawer.
I think that was sort of where this is leading.
I think there's it might actually be in a drawer as well.
Which puts you in an age range also, instead of, on my hard drive somewhere. Yeah. But yeah, had that been when you were developing as a writer or coming up, was that the idea, the goal down the line, or had you always thought in terms of journalism and nonfiction?
I'd always thought in terms of journalism and nonfiction, but I love fiction. I love, I'd kind of rather read fiction than I'll always admire John Updike more than Cy Hirsch, much as I admire the two of them,
You seen Wormwood yet?
Have I seen?
Wormwood? The Errol Morris documentary. Hirsch plays a key role in one of the most interesting scenes I've ever seen on film. But anyway, you'll catch it. It's a Netflix 6 episode series. But, it's Errol Morris doing his documentary and reenactment thing, but in very interesting ways. So
I wasn't really interested in writing fiction. And then when I wrote the Kerouac book, spending a year with this one book, the Kerouac book is really about on the road. It's about, a way of critically reading on the road. Spending that much time with a novel, I sort of saw it with its, in its underpants. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, that's what it is. I understand now. I can do that. And I had this idea that I would do a novel that would be, and my Kerouac book is sort of analyzing on the road as if it were a self-help book. And that sounds like a joke, but it's not quite. It's a serious analysis of the book, but it's taking a different way into it. So you're not at 10,000 feet as a literary critic, but you're getting into the text. And I thought another way to do that would be to take another great American book and kind of rewrite it in a different area. So instead of going through it in the genre of self-help, going at it through the genre of fiction. And it didn't work. In part because, like, you could do that with On the Road because the critical scholarship on the Road is not that good or not that deep. And I tried to do it with Moby Dick, and the critical scholarship on Moby Dick
turns out
really, 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 really good.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I can't add to that. No.
I think that was another Seymour Quast line, as a matter of fact. His the beginning of art for him was when he finally convinced himself that Saul Steinberg had not done every single thing great, that there was a little room left over for him, that I just had to escape from his shadow. And I was able to start making something. But yeah. So there's no David Gates, sitting on the subway writing these. I was on the LIRR, but, writing a psychotic journal that turned into a novel. That's not no. in the cards for you.
I do quote David Gates almost every week of my life, but
as one should. Yeah. My wife always throws out the line from Jernigan of, "For God's sake, Gil, is there anything you can't fuck up?" Which
that's a good line.
Takes as the sign of affection, but really, I guess it's kind of sad.
For me, it's Preston Falls when they go into the pretentious restaurant and they say, "Do you have reservations?" And he says, "Who wouldn't?"
Gotta love David, man. So you tried to go out as a pro wrestler.
I did go to school, professional wrestling school. I really did do that strictly to write
okay. I had wondered, because I just saw a one-line reference to it, and I thought, yeah, it's possible.
I never thought I'd make it as a wrestler.
Yeah.
But I loved it that at the end of the week, the teacher says, "Well, if you were to do this, I could see you as a heel." A heel is the bad guy in a wrestlers are divided into baby faces and heels. And the heel is the bad guy, because I could see you like bringing in a dirty trick like a sack of dimes. And I thought, okay, that's a good character.
Yeah. The wrestling teacher thinks I'm an asshole. This is great.
And the wrestling teacher was great. He was an old wrestler, and he had gout, so he could only drink champagne. And he taught in a wrestling school, so he could only drink like the cheapest champagne. And it's just hilarious. He had a crazy, dye job. And
was it in New York, or did you have to? I always think these things are either in New Jersey or Staten Island, but
it was near Camden.
Okay, so you did have to leave, the immediate vicinity. So, actually, what is New York to you? It's been about 42 years.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
And I lived here my first 3, so I guess it's been 45. Though I still think of myself as a Jersey boy.
Hey, where'd you grow up in Jersey, by the way?
Mountain Lakes, which is in Morris County.
Yeah, okay. I'm in Ringwood, which is Passaic, right on the corner of Bergen County. So we can always say, what exit are you off of? But, we're really beyond exits where we live.
Oh,
so.
I have one picture of my childhood where I'm pretty sure I'm in Ringwood State Park.
Yeah.
Someone asked me where it was. I said, I think that's Ringwood, because there's like a wooden fence in the background.
Yeah, there's the old manor houses and stuff from the 1700s, which they rebuilt over the years. But, it's one of those weird things. People have a New Jersey image, and it's just the turnpike, and the awful industrial wasteland and Bruce Springsteen. But, anyway, you're in New York. We're getting back to, we're getting away from my New Jersey.
Yeah. New York is a love affair to me. It's like an ongoing love affair. I don't like some of the ways that the city is going, but it's still the city. It's just this lively thing that fills you with energy kind of daily.
Mm-hmm. The New Times offices or the Old Times offices? What do you prefer?
In my Old Times office, someone came by my desk and said, "Geez, if you want to look outside, you have to go on the internet."
So, okay.
So here we're surrounded by glass. I think the building's beautiful. I prefer this. And we're also, being south of 42nd Street, it's a little bit less crazy.
And what brought you to the New York Times? Do you recall the moment of, holy shit, I'm a New York Times writer?
I never thought that. And I like that because, I'd done things before I came to the Times. So I'd never... There's the syndrome here, which is one of the editors used to use it. People think that of the New York Times is their last name.
As opposed to, and I swear to God, it's the single best line I've ever had on the show, second best actually. People from Harvard, it's within the first 90 seconds usually, right? That you find out that they attended Harvard.
Yeah, other people went to college. I went to college.
Yeah. George Prochnick, it was an hour and a half into the conversation when he mentioned going to Harvard for the first time, and I told him, I think that's a record. Usually it's the 90-second, not 90-minute mark. But anyway, people think of the New York Times as their surname.
That's sort of a line around here.
Yeah.
And when did I come to the Times?
It's around 2000 or so?
Yeah, I came in 2000. June 2000 I started. I came from Newsweek, and I was quite happy at Newsweek. I had a good job there, and I was doing stories that I liked. But I thought that, I guess maybe I was starting to feel a little bit of age. I thought, I'm going to work a limited period of time, and I would like to have worked at Newsweek and the New York Times, not just Newsweek and play this out. So, but the Times it's been great for me, but it was not I didn't feel I needed the Times to become somebody.
It wasn't validating you in terms of your career?
That's right.
What was your 9/11? And what sort of beat were you on professionally? And is that too tight a question to ask?
No,
okay,
no.
Yeah.
I worked in the home section when 9/11 hit. I guess sort of the whole style department. And my son was we lived in the East Village on East 12th Street, and my son was going to high school in St. Anne's, or I guess middle school in St. Anne's, which is in Brooklyn Heights. So he rode the train that went under the World Trade Center. So it was a huge panic that morning for me to find out where my son was. Mm-hmm. Was he okay? The telephones weren't working. The school was deluged with calls. So for me, it was a very small thing. I couldn't concentrate. I mean, my concentration was fairly limited. I had this one question I needed to answer. Is my son okay? I was not able to contemplate the magnitude of the event. Sure. Because that was the most important thing. And then when he finally, found out he had gone to a friend's house, one of my friend's house, they had taken him in Brooklyn. Then when the bridge opened up, I was able to walk across the bridge and go get him. So a lot of my day was just taken up with this practical matter. And then there was time when I was just interviewing people on the street because it was all hands on deck. Yeah, what was that? Do you remember, or did those days stick out particularly in terms of what New York was in that immediate aftermath? I think it took a day to sink in how horrible this was. I mean, we were finding out more about who did it and why. But it took a day, maybe even a little more than that, to understand just what an atrocity this was. And I would say that the city was never nicer or kinder than that period of time immediately after the attacks. And I remember playing going to the basketball courts in my neighborhood with my son. And we played 2-on-2 against a couple of doctors that we didn't know. It was just sort of a pickup game. And we played, and they scored a basket, we scored a basket, we missed some shots, and then the guy says, stop. I'm sorry, I didn't ask. Is all your family okay? Yeah. And it was just like, oh. Yeah, we're all in a war zone, sort of, but your heart's breaking. There we are just on East 12th Street. We're not very far from it, and it's probably still smoking at the time. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, that immediate weeks after, but yeah. But it was a time when, especially this is maybe more true downtown than elsewhere, that people didn't want to be in their apartments looking at the TV. So people were out. It was, it was those warm September nights, and people were out on the streets, and they were communal. They weren't, it was almost like partying, but people weren't partying. They were somber, but there were a lot of people that were out at restaurants or walking the streets or gathering in Union Square. And you would walk by, your local firehouse. There'd be pictures of the dead there. And it took me weeks before I could walk home without crying. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like a grown-up? Well, that grown, that's a good question. I would say a grown-up, that language suggests that there's a process that's been completed.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're always changing. I think we're always improvising our characters in response to our situations. And that's part of what I deal with in writing about aging. Old age is not something, like if you're grown up at a certain point, you're complete, then old age is something tacked on at the end after a story that's already done. And I've come not to believe that. I've come to think it's not that. It's just 90 is just the year after 89, and 89 is just the year that's 20 years after 69. You know, we're always growing up. So I would say I'm a growing up.
I only ask because one of the very early episodes I ever did was with Michael Dirda, the book reviewer at the Washington Post, and reading, I think it was his memoir. Every age thinks they're the first people ever to experience X, Y, or Z. And he was really the first guy 20-ish years older than me to say that he didn't understand how his parents had, you know, fully formed roles and lives, and he didn't. Whereas, of course, I assumed we were the first generation ever to experience that in my stupid way. And Michael and I bonded from there on over, you know, the sense constantly of I've got no idea how people actually, you know, were responsible and knew what they were doing once upon a time, which leads you to conclude that nobody ever knew. They just put up a better act than other people did. But that's why I'd wondered in certain respects if you had felt, you know, adult and you know, in a grown-up role. But, you know, I think I appreciate more the way you're framing it. Even these guys are still figuring it out in their 80s and 90s.
I mean, I do feel adult. I feel like I live a responsible life, and you know, I try to be productive and generative and not just consume things and want to be praised.
There's something to be said for that. It's, you know, ugly American, but there's something to be said. But, you know, and what's the reception been like so far? I know the book is just coming out, but have you been hearing from people who were readers of the Times series? Are they picking up on the fact that there's a companion book now?
Well, people who are 89 or so are unanimously over the moon about this, but they're all my mother.
Oh.
So that doesn't count.
Did she resent anything in terms of how you portrayed her in the book, by the way?
No, she was entirely open to it. And I didn't discuss much of it with her before writing it. There was one episode that she's in that involves like a sort of, I'll tell you about a man moved into her building, and my mother had never dated after my father died. And she took up a little bit of a special friendship with this guy for a very brief period of time, and then he died. And we talked about that, and she says, well, you know, she did have this guy that she would have dinner with. And she says, well, no, I was just interested in him. He was an interesting guy. He was an economist. And I had studied economics in college, and so I was interested in him. But there was never a love affair there. And so my mother was very sensitive about that. So I showed her that part of the book.
You just didn't want to be portrayed as a harlot or something. I'm just kidding.
She didn't want it to look like this was a great love affair in her life when it wasn't.
Gotcha. Have the surviving subjects of the book seen it yet?
They all have. Everybody's got a copy of the book. Mm-hmm. And the responses have been really good.
Yeah. Because I had wondered, I assumed, you know, they were, well, I guess that's a question. Was there a degree to which you, as the series was going on in the Times, that they also may have, people are reading this, I should, you know, be a little more demonstrative or be X, Y, or Z in front of John because this is going to go into the next installment?
I think so. There's a woman in the book named Ruth Willig. The book has 6 main characters plus my mother, plus me. And there's a woman named Ruth Willig. And Ruth had been forced to move out of her assisted living facility because the owner was selling it because he could make more money selling it for luxury housing. And Ruth was really mad about that. And I think the other people were really mad about that. And not without reason. You shouldn't have to be made homeless at 90 years old because somebody wants money. So, and she didn't make the friends. She was in a new building. It was quite a lovely building, but it was far from where she was and far from her daughter. And she missed the people in the old building. I didn't think people in the new building were quite the same. And it made her think, what's the point in living anymore for me, really? What do I have? And when she saw that in the paper, she was really upset by it. She thought it made her look too negative, and she wasn't really that negative. And, it took me a while to understand that Ruth's criticism of situations was her way of exerting some control over it. She's saying, I'm not passively accepting what's happening to me. I'm at least critically judging it.
Yeah.
And that she wasn't just being negative, she was being assertive.
Gotcha.
And so she had to correct me on that. And so she objected to her portrayal in the first installment of it.
But not claiming to be misquoted, but at least just you weren't getting the nuances of what she meant. Okay. Which
was great, because it allowed me to create a deeper portrait of her.
Beyond the emotional reframing you went through in this process, were there aspects of preparing for old age that you're picking up on? Literally in terms of, not ending up being homeless at 90, things like that. Did you look at the practical aspects of what it's going to mean for you to live that long?
I was pretty good on the practical aspects. Okay. I've, always put money into a retirement account, and I've, tried to take care of my health a little bit. Mm-hmm. So what I needed was the sense that these years had meaning. They were as valuable as the years in the beginning of my life or the middle of my life. And it was up to me to find that meaning or create that meaning.
And now you can go back and finish your novel. Just kidding.
You can.
Yeah, I know.
You should always
I just think you don't want to finish or go back to that particular novel is all I mean.
I don't think I do.
One thing you want reader to take from the book?
I want that the wisdom of old age is really valuable to us right now. The time to start, if you're not living your life now, if you're waiting for something, go ahead and live it. If you're afraid of the future, don't be afraid of the future. The future is just tomorrow. Just go ahead and live it. You have I think we have extraordinary, as I say, influence over how we process our lives. And that's
good.
True when you're young, true when you're old.
Perfect point to end. John Leland, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Oh, Gil, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Sorry I lost some of my voice in the first third, I guess.
It's okay. And that was John Leland. His new book is Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old, from Sarah Crichton Books, an imprint of FSG. John doesn't have a web page, but he is on Twitter at John Leland, JohnLeland. You should also look him up at the New York Times website because he's written some really good stuff over the years. We first connected when I read his profile of Liz Smith last year and thought, wow, whoever wrote that is somebody I want to sit down and talk to. And that's how I discovered the new book, and, well, that's what led to this episode. His Twitter feed also has info on his upcoming events for the book, including the ones on January 23rd and 25th in New York City, in case you're listening to this around the time it went live and you want to talk to John about the book. Oh, and our bonding over David Gates was tied into the fact that John was an editor at Newsweek when David reviewed books and music there. As I was researching John, I realized there are a lot of people we both know, me through the podcast, him through actually having a life, like David, Richard Gere, Ashton Applewhite, people like that. So it's kind of neat to see someone who, has all those connections without forcing it with a podcast. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked John, so who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that should have gone up already, but I'll get to it this week, okay? You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. And there are all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my new secret project that I'm starting to get all anxiety-ridden about, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode as part of back-to-back sessions in New York City, as I mentioned, along with next week's show with Ann Hulbert. It was the usual $12 at the GW, $30 for parking, $6 for the subway, coffee and pastry at Dean and DeLuca outside the New York Times offices, and I think that was it. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, parking, and coffee, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. The special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasek, and Michael Janizik for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Now, our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Ann Hulbert, author of the new book, Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies. It was kind of neat to go from discussing child prodigies to discussing people 85 years and older over the course of an afternoon, and that's sort of the fun of the podcast. Till next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories. Oh, we're also on tunein.com. Just search for Virtual Memories Show or Gil Roth, and you'll find the show there. Apparently, tunein.com is what will allow you to listen to the podcast on your Amazon Echo devices if you so choose. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.